Now, what are we going to do now? We talked about Hegel last time, and I actually wanted to finish it off today, but then I realized that it will actually be much better if we postpone it to after we talk about, first of all, natural law theory and St. Thomas Aquinas, and more importantly, Aristotle, because to understand Hegel, Aristotle is very important. And we will talk about Aristotle next week anyway, so it's all related, so I thought why not talk about this stuff first, and then we'll come back to Hegel next week, probably on Wednesday. So that's what we're going to do. Let's talk about natural law theory. So what exactly is it? It holds that there are moral laws found in nature and noticeable using reason. In other words, that morality is not whatever we make it up to be, that there is actually such a fundamental thing as natural law. Now, of course, for the most part, it would be theological, so coming from religion or God or something, but not necessarily. You may not even believe in God and still believe that there are some natural laws. An interesting example actually would be Aristotle, who didn't believe in, well, Christian God didn't even exist at the time. There was a Jewish God, but Aristotle didn't believe in Jewish God. He had his own theory. However, he is an example of the, what you may say, natural law theory, because he actually thought that there is such thing as human nature and nature in general. So we will talk about Aristotle today. Moral laws are prescriptive, right? So they always tell us what we ought to do. They don't just describe it. On the other hand, laws of nature themselves are descriptive. We're not making any kind of ought statement when we say law of gravity demands that objects always drop on the ground. So science in general itself is descriptive. It describes nature. It doesn't try to prescribe anything to nature. But for morality, of course, we have an ought. Now, few other people to mention. Thomas Jefferson and Locke both identified natural human rights. If you read the Constitution, you'll see that founding fathers definitely believed that there is something such as natural law, natural human rights, which do not depend on convention, which are there for us to follow. United Nations also issued a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that is shared by all human beings. Natural law and human rights linked through the idea that certain human rights are natural rights. Again, you don't have to necessarily believe in God for that, but obviously most people who believe there are natural human rights also believe in God. Now, interesting example was the Nuremberg trials. You know what happened after World War II? There is a movie out right now. I think it's available on Prime, Amazon Prime. So if you have Amazon Prime, you can take a look at it. On Nuremberg trial. It was indeed very interesting because when the war ended, the question, Second World War, the question arose, what do we do about all these people? Hitler committed suicide, but there was a whole bunch of them still left around. And they captured them. But then, how do you just summarily execute them because they are the enemy? It seemed a little bit wrong, so they wanted to have a trial. But at the same time, what law? What law would you be using? The German law? Well, they were the German law. They were running the country. They did not violate German law. So, American law? Can you just take American law and put people in a different country and trial in American law? Well, apparently you can, because it's been done quite a lot recently. But at least in 1945, it was still novel. And plus, there were other allies, right? Great Britain and even Soviet Union. Many people now don't realize, but it was an ally of United States and England and Great Britain, and they all together were fighting. France also was an ally, although France obviously played less of a role. And they were all victors. They all achieved victory. And so they all had to participate somehow in this trial. But they were looking for a particular law, and they decided to just go with this kind of natural law theory, that there are certain natural human rights which were violated by the Nazi regime. They are not German laws, they were not American laws, they were not Russian laws, but if you believe that there is some kind of natural human law, then you can see that clearly what they were doing violates this law, because those mass execution of innocent people, genocide, all of this has to be a violation of some sort of law. So that was the idea. Now, historical origins, like I said, it actually goes back to Aristotle, which is why Aristotle is good to mention even before Aquinas. And Stoics, we mentioned Stoics when we talked about Kant. Stoics were after Aristotle, but they also accepted from Aristotle this idea that there is some natural law. Nature has a goal or telos for humans which we ought to pursue. We will see that this is exactly what Aristotle was saying. And finally, St. Thomas Aquinas, medieval philosophy in general, which we will mostly talk about next time on Wednesday, but today we can mention some of it too. So medieval philosophy obviously refers to the Middle Ages. St. Thomas Aquinas was active during the 13th century. What exactly are Middle Ages? It's a roughly 1,000 years period, which starts from the fall of Rome in 476. I think we mentioned it when we talked about Augustine, St. Augustine. So that would be the moment when Rome fell, 476, the beginning of the Middle Ages. And then it's hard to draw the line on the other side, but usually, actually, it's considered to be the Great Plague in the 15th century. So roughly somewhere around that time, about 1,000 years total. Now, what was happening? The Roman Empire started to collapse even before that. One of the problems they had, it became too big. And at the time, it was difficult to run such a huge empire because, well, if you issue an order from Rome, it had to be physically carried. They didn't have internet, right? It had to be physically carried to all the parts of the empire by horse, by boat, and so on. And that could take weeks. So it was very inefficient in that sense. And at some point, they decided to have kind of a second center in Constantinople. But turned out that was a mistake, because after a little while, that center became so important by itself that it became kind of two centers, two halves of the empire, and it already had some seeds of the split. They had disagreements with Rome, and eventually did in fact split. Another problem was with those invaders, Goths. First they sacked Rome in 410, then finally in 476 the empire fell completely because, well, funny thing happened, by the way. They still had Senate and they still had the Roman system of government, but because those Vandals and other tribes were able to defeat the army and capture Rome, they actually were in charge. They could execute any senators they wanted. They could execute anybody. They could issue laws themselves which would override the Roman law, but they didn't do it for the most part. They allowed Romans to still have their system of government just because they didn't want to bother with all those little things. And so they were in charge, but at the same time the imperial system of Rome still was functioning under them. So that was an interesting time. Now at the time the church started to get more and more control, because since all those tribes were not really a state and Roman Empire started collapsing, there was a lot of local governments of all sorts. And the church had a lot more unifying power, and in fact a lot more power than any of the local lords or kings or any of the local authorities. The biggest power, of course, was the Pope. So that explains a little bit about what was happening. Another thing which emerged at the time of interest to us is the rise of the universities. How did the first university appear? Well, it kind of slowly started growing out of the cathedral schools. Charlemagne, in around 800s, introduced those cathedral schools, which were really meant to educate monks and religious people. And this is what slowly kind of started to become what we today call university. And the very word itself actually is a Latin word, universitas, which means a number of persons associated into one body, society, company, community, guild, or corporation. Guilds at the time were very popular for a simple reason, that all the professional people wanted to protect their interests. And universitas was just the same thing, but for professors and students. Professors and students also wanted to protect their interests against local population, against the local lords, and so on. And they organized and had some system of self-government. The first universities started flourishing around 13th century. It would be Paris, Bologna, Naples, Montpellier, Oxford, and Cambridge. It's actually funny how Cambridge has been founded. What happened there is the students who were students of Oxford had a lot of problem with local population. They started quarreling because local population didn't like students. They never do, right? Students are troublemakers. They get drunk, they're disorderly, they rent their accommodation, so there's no accommodation left, which is, by the way, a huge problem in Oxford even today. It's almost impossible to find private accommodation in the center of Oxford. Everything belongs to colleges. And at the time, the quarrel got so bad that some of the students said, okay, you know what, to hell with you. We had enough of this, we are leaving. Let's see how you feel without us. So they took off and they moved to Cambridge, to another town which is like several hundred miles away. And they founded Cambridge University. So some of the students still stayed, continued with Oxford. Some students founded Cambridge University. So what exactly were they studying at the time? 7 liberal arts. That was kind of a type of a bachelor's degree. First they started with trivium. That would be grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, art of writing, speaking, and argumentation. I think that they did it for a couple of years. Then they would move to so-called quadrium, which included arithmetic, mathematics basically, geometry, and also music and astronomy. They believed that music and astronomy are closely related, especially music, closely related to mathematics. Now, once students were done with this, they would get bachelor's degree, and then they could continue and get master's degree and a doctorate, or they could just go and get some other profession or whatever it is they wanted to do with their life. Now, if you continued, interestingly, also there were only 3 doctorates available. No, 4, right? 4 doctorates. You could become doctor of law, in which case you would be practicing legal profession. You could become doctor of medicine, in which case you would be a doctor. You could become doctor of philosophy, and you could become doctor of theology, which actually considered the highest one. Theology would be religious study. So that's why today we only have PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, in chemistry, mathematics, physics and like a whole bunch of other sciences, because that at the time was just philosophy. There was nothing other than philosophy, medicine, law, and theology. Okay, why are we talking about this? Because when we talk about Thomas Aquinas, you will see that that actually explains a lot of his work and a lot of the way he was conducting himself. At the time, slowly so-called scholasticism started to emerge in the universities. They were teaching in scholastic method. What does it mean? Scholastic literally means schoolman. So it actually is not a funny word, but it had a more specific meaning. At the time, anyone who learned or taught in the schools Charlemagne first established, which became universities, were called scholastics. What are they doing at these first universities? They were trying to integrate faith and reason. That was literally the goal. They were trying to square the Bible with philosophy. If you completed the bachelor's level studies and moved on, you would literally be working on that area, especially in theology and philosophy. Integrating faith and reason, working to harmonize the church doctrine, questions which they would look at, and they accepted this Aristotelian method. This is the example. Is the existence of God self-evident? And then they would argue for and against. This is exactly what Aquinas was doing. His readings, I do want to assign some reading for Wednesday, let me see. But all his readings are like this. So for and against. And they would cite authorities, variety of authorities. First of all, Holy Scriptures, of course, New Testament, Old Testament. That was the Word of God, so that is not to be questioned. But it can be interpreted in a variety of different ways, right? So then they also used the Church Fathers as an authority. Augustine, who we talked about last time, Boethius, that's another important figure who also is considered a philosopher. And what actually is most interesting for us today, the works of Aristotle. The works of Aristotle were mainly lost. In fact, they were lost several times. For several centuries after Aristotle's death, most of his work was somehow lost. Then they found, 1st century BC, they found this little, what do they call it, script, a little cave, you can say, with some of his work, long lost. Most of this work was actually his lecture notes. And they organized them and they preserved them, but then they kind of got slightly lost again. For about 1,000 years in Europe, the only work of Aristotle which was translated and preserved were his logical works, the works on logic. Everything else, so that would be categories, the interpretazione, everything else was lost. In the 13th century, what actually happened, 12th, 13th century, is some of this came back, and it came back for an interesting reason because of the Crusades. During the Crusades, the knights went into Palestine, they were fighting to liberate it, just like today. And they were bringing back the works of Aristotle, many of them in Arabic language, also some in Greek language. And what happened at the time is actually very interesting because students at the university were first prohibited from reading these works of Aristotle. Why? Because they did not work very well with the church doctrine. Many of the Aristotelian ideas seemed like were incompatible with Christianity. Now, what happened as a result, you can imagine, of course, young people don't listen to the authority, so instead of studying it in a classroom, they were studying it elsewhere and discussing it privately. Of course, that was not good too, so eventually church authorities started to allow it in the classroom, so at least it would be done in an organized manner. Thomas Aquinas, who we'll talk about on Wednesday, was a huge fan of Aristotle. When he discovered Aristotle, he fell in love with him, and his entire philosophy is very closely connected to Aristotle, even though obviously it's not just a copy of Aristotle's philosophy, because Thomas Aquinas was a Christian philosopher. He does believe in the Bible and New and Old Testament, so he couldn't just completely accept Aristotle. Some of the Aristotle's writings clearly are different, but he said it still is compatible. Well, this is a good illustration here, by the way, the early university in Germany, the way they were studying. This is a professor standing there reading something, and the students are discussing it and writing something down too. The books, obviously, at the time were enormously expensive because they were all handwritten, so only rich people could have few books. But at least you could write something yourself. Okay, so now let's talk about Aristotle. We will continue with Thomas Aquinas next time, but Aristotle, since we will talk about him anyway next week, and with virtue ethics, basically is Aristotle's contribution to modern philosophy, and also is relevant to Thomas Aquinas. So remember, we talked about Plato last time, and we had this picture. Let's bring it back. So two towering figures of philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing upwards. Why is he pointing upwards? You hopefully remember. What was Plato's theory? Let's refresh our memory on Plato. A couple of details you skipped. People are in chains looking at the wall and trying to interpret shadows, which is the normal world, right? So you can, let me try to draw it somehow. So this is the wall. There is another partition. The prisoners are chained, looking at the wall only. They cannot look behind them. Remember, there is a source of fire. There are some other people, and we kind of wondered who they might be. Hard to say, but they are holding some sort of cutouts of horses and so on, and the light reflects on that wall, and this is what they try to interpret. Every once in a while, one of these prisoners is able to escape into what you may say reality, the outside world, out of the cave. And what did this person find there? The forms. Remember, the forms is the true reality according to Plato. You have a form of justice. You have a form of bravery. What is it? It's not part of our world. It's part of some other world. But it serves as an ideal of everything we can compare to. So if you want to know if somebody is brave, you compare it to this form of bravery. The forms are not part of the world. They are part of the outside reality. And the sun is the form of the good, which gives everything its light. Now, of course, then the story goes that person comes back to the cave, tries to explain it to the prisoners. The prisoners get mad at him and execute him. It doesn't say so in the allegory itself, but obviously it implied that like Socrates was one of those people and they executed him. Okay, so that's why he's pointing upwards, right? This reality is outside the cave, somewhere in the sky, you may say. The world itself, according to Plato, is basically a big lie. Those shadows are lies. Our senses lying to us because everything we see constantly changes. And the true reality cannot change. The true reality, the numbers, is the best example. 2 + 2 = 4, eternal truth. That will be true a million years from now, just as it was true a million years ago. Now Aristotle, note, is kind of pointing him downwards, grounding the whole thing. And that's exactly what he did. He is a lot less, well, poetic, you may say. right? So who was Aristotle? Few facts about him. He was born in 384 BC. Note that that's about 15 years after Socrates was already executed. So he never met Socrates, wasn't alive during Socrates' time, but he did become student of Plato. He joined his academy at the age of 18. He was a star student. In fact, for a while, they probably thought he was going to replace Plato after his death. He was with the academy all the way until Plato's death in 348, at which point he was, 36 years old, with the academy for about 18 years. Unfortunately, after Plato has died, he did not get to replace him. Instead, Plato's nephew replaced him. Now, whether there was any nepotism involved, hard to say, but you may wonder. A nephew. Well, anyway, Aristotle probably didn't feel great about it, so he left. He left Athens for a while. He was studying marine biology. He actually is very science-oriented from the beginning. Then he was summoned to the Macedonian court. In fact, he was born in Macedonia. And Macedonians are part of this Greek world, but they are not exactly Greeks. In fact, they were considered foreigners at the time. But Macedonian king summoned him to tutor his son, whose name was Alexander. And that would be Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great had Aristotle as his personal tutor from the age 13. Now, of course, when he grew up, he went on to conquer the world, which if you want to know, you can watch the movie Alexander, which was pretty big a few years ago. And Aristotle didn't obviously join him. Instead, he returned to Athens and found his own school. It was called Lyceum. And in fact, and today you hear the name Lyceum, that's where that name comes from. Just like academy comes from the Plato's academy, Lyceum comes from Aristotle's school, which simply was called Lyceum because it was next to the church or something of the certain hero called Lyceum. So pure coincidence. Then what actually happened is Alexander the Great died. Alexander the Great was in control of Greece. He was in control of Athens. He was in control of this whole kingdom. And the Greeks were not very happy about that because, remember, they considered Macedonians to be kind of a little bit of a foreigners. So to them, being subjects to some sort of king who is not Greek was problematic. When he died, they were very happy, and they started also prosecuting all the Macedonian people, including Aristotle. And Aristotle, as far as we know, escaped Athens. He ran away, and he said that he did it so Athens wouldn't sin second time against philosophy. When did they sin for the first time against philosophy? When they executed Socrates, obviously. So he didn't want to follow Socrates' fate, but unfortunately, a year later, he died anyway from natural causes, I guess. So that's the life of Aristotle. Now, if we compare Plato and Aristotle, what we already saw from that painting, but you could see already on that painting the idea. Plato is a lot more idealistic, inspiring, outwardly perfectionist. Aristotle, on the other hand, a lot more realistic, scientific, this-worldly, and pragmatic. It's a little bit misleading. One of the reasons why it may not give us the entire picture is Plato's work, which we have, is meant for general public. All those dialogues are written in a very poetic style. They're easy to read. But with Aristotle, we know he actually had work like this. It just didn't survive. It's completely lost. What we do have of Aristotle is mostly his lecture notes. He was probably writing it for himself, so it would be easier for him, like the kind of PowerPoints, right, to do lectures. And as a result, they have this very bad language, the kind of language which is difficult to read even in Greek. all the translations of Aristotle are very hard to read for this reason too. And actually, I didn't assign any Aristotle yet, but we should read Aristotle for next week. Typically, he is recommended to be read in Greek. And if you don't read him in Greek, the best idea is to read one of the books which has a lot of commentary explaining these words, because Greek words don't align very well with English words. So if you do translation, no matter how well you do it, it will never give you really a good idea. We will read it in English, obviously, but keep that in mind. It's pretty hard to do it on one hand so it could be smooth reading, and at the same time faithful to what he was writing. There's like, the best translators do their best, but it's almost impossible. You either achieve one, in which case it's smooth reading, but then when you look at the Greek text, it's like, well, it's not really what he said. Or it's very faithful, but then it's like, what? That's impossible to read. What is this stuff? So unfortunately, there's no way around it. Now, one of his most famous books would be Metaphysics. And we can start by talking a little bit about his metaphysics, his theory of knowledge, his epistemology, because they did affect not just his ethical ideas, his moral philosophy, but moral philosophy and philosophy in general of Thomas Aquinas and so on. Metaphysics famously starts with this statement: all human beings by nature desire to know. And that is something which Thomas Aquinas later will be really impressed by. Note that it immediately mentions nature. All human beings by nature desire to know. So it's not just that we like knowing things. The human nature is such that we desire to know. That is one of the special qualities of human beings. But unlike Plato, he actually immediately says that sense experience, our eyes, our ears, give us knowledge. He did not think that, remember, for Plato, this is all shadows which not worth wasting time on. You should think about the forms. Aristotle immediately says, no, that actually is very useful to us. Our eyes and our ears, even though they are not as reliable as mathematics, but they definitely give us knowledge, and we should embrace this knowledge. Another thing he also mentions is that the most important knowledge we can have is the knowledge of the causes. What causes certain things? A person who knows ultimate causes and principles governing things has wisdom. So you can think about this in this way. Let's say 3 people study a tree. One of them is an artist. What is the way the artist would look at the tree? Artist would probably revel in its individuality, particularity, how beautiful this tree is. Maybe write a beautiful poem about it, right? How about gardener? Gardener would look at purely practical point of view, right? Like, what type of fertilizer do you use for it so it would grow better? But the scientist looks at it differently. Scientist, according to Aristotle, and scientist at the time was the same thing as philosopher basically, seeks general understanding of trees in terms of their universal character. What is in common between all the trees? So he started by classifying, like, right, this is an elm tree or oak tree, and so on. The classification of different species and genders is what Aristotle was the first one to introduce. And then he would look for necessary connection among them. What is accidental? What is necessary? Necessary things is the most important part of the knowledge. And Aristotle also thought, and that will help us to understand Hegel better, that language, thought, and reality are closely connected. Structures of language mirror structures of our thought, and structures of our thought mirror the reality. the good way to put it would be that language more or less divides reality at the joints. So if you want to know reality well, you can just study the language. In this case, Greek language, obviously, but languages all have something in common. Now, Aristotle was actually the first one to discover logic. The entire body of logic, and I talk about it in Philosophy 102, was systematized by Aristotle, and for about 2,000 years, actually, that was the body of knowledge which hardly even changed. Stoics did make some contributions to it, but the foundation of logic was laid out by Aristotle, and even today, if you take any logic class, you'll see that actually that part comes from Aristotle. It hasn't changed very much. One of the reasons is he really thought that what we see in language, that is something which describes the reality. Aristotle did a lot of work on it. He worked with syllogism. Syllogism, syllogismos, is in Greek, is just some sort of argument or conclusion. Here's an example. We did see it at the beginning of class, and we saw it in Philosophy 102. If you look at all mothers are females, some parents are not females, therefore some parents are not mothers. So just a quick illustration again, in case if you forgot. Remember that you can extract the form of this argument, which would be something like this. All M are F, right? And that form of an argument is what determines whether it's valid or not. It doesn't matter whether they talk about mothers, females, or anything else. In fact, if you take slightly higher level logic, you will see that you can analyze it with a Venn diagram. You can draw a Venn diagram, which is basically just 3 overlapping circles, 2 of them for P and M, which is subject and predicate term of your conclusion. The third one for an F, which is the middle term, so-called middle term. Then you can start analyzing it by drawing Venn diagrams first for this statement, all M are F, so you have to block all M outside of F. Some P are not F would mean that you have to put an X into a P circle outside of the F circle. So this is your P circle, this is your F circle. It would have to go here. P outside of F. And then you can look at the conclusion and see whether or not conclusion is supported. That would have to be something like this. You would have to have X and P circle outside of M circle. Do you have the X and P circle outside of M circle here? That means it's a valid argument. So you actually, Aristotle didn't draw that. This is more of a modern invention. But he did work with these types of syllogism, and he showed that this is in fact how it works. Now, without going into this theory very deeply, just to remind you that it doesn't matter whether this is true or false. Whether it's true or false is not part of logic. But if we assume our premises to be true, when the argument is valid, conclusion will always be true. And that is something Aristotle discovered. Then he also discovered that there are certain things, of course, which you cannot use deductive method to understand, but you have to do observation. And that would be what is happening with nature. However, you have to have certain first principles which you then going to apply. And these first principles or axioms themselves do not have any proof. So this is the difference between induction and deduction. Deduction just starts with the first principles already given and then goes through the steps to reach certain conclusion. Induction, on the other hand, starts with observation when you don't have any principles yet. So a good example would be Galileo. Galileo was dropping objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa and measuring time how long it will take for them to fall. He didn't know if there's any principle to that, but he discovered there was. It turns out that the time it takes for them to fall is proportional to the square root of a distance, no matter how big or heavy they are. And that then is the first principle he discovered. So Aristotle discovered that some of the first principles were also laws of logic, necessary for everything, that would be, first of all, law of non-contradiction. A cannot be both B and not B. Right? So if you have A, either it is identical to B or not. It cannot be both. Similarly, if something is true, it cannot be false at the same time. Then there is law of excluded middle, which means for any A and B, A must either be B or not be. And finally, law of identity, A is A. So this is some of the basic things which most people don't even think about, but they are at the foundation of any reasoning. Because if you disagree with that, you cannot reason at all. There is simply no way to reason. Now, an induction is just this process of slowly looking at the world and discovering the similarities. Science does it all the time today. If you do any kind of science project or something, experiments, this is what you're looking for. Certain regularities, right? For example, you want to know whether a pill is working. You give it to a group of people. You have two groups. One of them you give a pill. The other ones you give a placebo, right? Then you are calculating what is the outcome. Is there a difference in this outcome? If there is a difference, obviously it would have to apply to, well, if not everybody, then most people. If there's only one person who has an effect out of 100, that's a coincidence. But if all of them or most of them are getting better from this pill, whereas placebo doesn't make any difference, that means the pill is working. So you're looking for some sort of generalization, for a certain regularity to this whole thing. And Aristotle also thought that there is certain intuition which we have to apply to this. And the reason is the world does have this rational order. It is already in the world itself. And so when we use our mind or nose, we are able to discover these regularities. Okay, another interesting concept he introduced is the concept of substance. Substance, we already mentioned it in a more modern way. And by the way, Kant thought that substance actually is one of those categories our mind has to use to understand objects. To Aristotle, however, it was a little bit different. His early work categories thought of substances as just individuals you can talk about, such as Socrates, Mount Olympus, Fido the dog, tree in my backyard, and so on. So there are entities which underlie everything else, and everything else is either predicated of them or present in them. And by the way, the word predicated in Greek is kategorai, which is where the word categories come from. So substances defined by the role they play in statements. In a statement, if you predicate something out of it, then that would be your substance. Here's some of the essential categories according to Aristotle. The first, the substance answers the question, what is it? What is it? Like, what is this? Marker, so that's a substance. Or a tree, or a man. Then he found several other categories, which, by the way, Kant also talks about quantity. How many of it? How large is it? 30 feet, 6 feet tall. Quality. What is it like? Corner bearing, wise. Relation. Bigger, smaller, half the size. Place. In the grove. Time. Position. So you see these categories coming back from Aristotle. This is what actually Kant would be trying to work with and figure out what exactly they are, but they go all the way back to Aristotle. And metaphysics in general, the word metaphysics, how did we even get this word? The word, it's a funny story, because when they discovered the works of Aristotle, he had the work which was on describing the rules the world has, and it was called Physica. which in Greek is just the study of nature. Physis is nature, remember? And then there was another work which was kind of going further than that. It was more speculative, and it was trying to discover the real nature of things, what is being, the study of being, as Aristotle himself called it. And for a lack of better word, Andronicus, who was the one discovering it, called it, well, whatever goes after the physics, which in Greek is metaphysica. So that's how we got the word metaphysica. Ta meta, ta physica. Whatever goes after the physics. So Aristotle himself never used this word, but today we're using it because of this accident. And it was trying to figure out what is ultimately real. Remember, for Plato, what is ultimately real are the forms. The forms which are outside of this world, they are the ultimately real stuff. But for Aristotle, it is substances. Substances is the ultimate reality. And he develops it in metaphysics even further. He actually talks about Plato's forms and says Plato's forms are completely useless for us. And these are the 5 reasons he says they are useless. First of all, they have no explanatory power. How does it help to us? Remember, to know or to imagine that there is a form of justice. Well, it's in some sort of different world. We don't have access to this world, so it's actually not helping us at all. Then they cannot explain change. According to Plato, forms do not change. They are eternal. But the world does change. And that doesn't help us to understand why. According to Plato, it's just some unfortunate byproduct of the world being not fully real. Well, that's not very helpful, is it? We live in this world. What, are we supposed to just die and then everything will be real? No, we have to study the world as it is. The forms cannot be the essence or substance of things because they are separate from them. And that is one of the biggest problems Aristotle had. How can they be somewhere else in a different reality? Also, he thought it was not clear how the forms actually relate to the instantiations of the forms. What is this participation? Like the marker participates in the form of markedness? And finally, the third man argument, meaning if we need a form to explain what is similar between the man and the humanity, then perhaps we need a form to explain what is similar between this similarity. So all these reasons moved Aristotle to completely reject Platonic idea of the forms, but he had his own idea of the forms. And he connected it to substance. So substance, according to Aristotle, has actually 2 parts. One of them is form, and the other one is matter. Whereas Plato's forms are transcendent. They are outside the world. Aristotelian forms are immanent. Immanent means they are part of the world. They are within the world. They are intrinsic to things. The fundamental reality is the collection of substances we find in everyday experience. So, like I said, it has 2 parts. 2 parts which you can call the whatness and the thisness of everything. The whatness is the universal part. And that would be something which is common amongst many entities. It answers the question, what is it? So Socrates, what is Socrates? A Greek. There are many different Greeks. That's one of them, right? A philosopher. Again, many philosophers. That's one of the philosophers. He has something in common with the other philosophers. Short and bald man. Well, he's not the only short and bald man, but that is one other attributes he has. Now, thisness would be something more particular. He's this particular Greek standing there in this slovenly toga, occupying specific amount of space at a particular time, say June 6, 420 BC, right? So now you're actually narrowing it down to this specific item. And in a similar way, all the substances have these 2 parts, form and matter. Whatness is the form or essence of everything. And thisness is the matter or individualization. Matter is what makes certain items what they are, right? So essence of a thing is this kind of a dictionary definition, you may say. So for example, what is the essence of a coffee cup? What is coffee cup for? What do you do with it? Coffee. If it's coffee cup, then it holds coffee. Exactly. So does it have to be made of clay? No, it doesn't. As long as it's doing what it's supposed to do, it would be a coffee cup. If it doesn't, on the other hand, then it's not a coffee cup, it's something else. But if you have a specific coffee cup, does it have to be made of a specific material? Yeah. I mean, if it's not made of any material, then how is it a coffee cup? It's not a coffee cup, right? So that would be then the matter of that specific coffee cup, whereas the form of this coffee cup is just the purpose it serves. It's the essence of a coffee cup. What is it there for? And in a similar way, all the substances have potentiality and actuality. Potentiality is associated with matter, right? Matter is always potentially anything. If you have just a clump of clay, you can make a coffee cup out of it. Can you make something else out of it? Sure, you can make almost anything out of it. But once you made it, then it becomes specific item. But actuality, that would be what it already is. And it's important for when we will talk about Hegel, and it is important for Thomas Aquinas too. Potentiality becomes actuality, right? Acorn and an oak tree. Acorn is potentially an oak tree. It's not an oak tree yet. But if you think about it, why is it potentially an oak tree? Okay, but like this marker is not going to grow up to be an oak tree, and acorn will. So it actually, like certain items already have the potential to become something else, right? And that something else is kind of their goal, their end state. So actuality is always associated with the form. You need a form to have something actual, but matter is associated with potentiality. So that explains change, something which, remember, Plato was not trying to explain, but Aristotle is really concerned about that. Form and matter by themselves do not explain change, but this idea of potentiality and actuality is. Okay, let's try to understand his other important idea of causes. So let's say we're talking about a house. What causes a house to be? What do you need to build a house? Well, maybe we're talking about both. Let's just list everything. So what do we need to build a house?
Materials.
Materials is first of all, right? You need a certain material out of which you will be building a house. If you don't have any material, if you don't have bricks or wood or whatever else, you're not going to build a house. Not going to happen. What else? Yeah. People who will be building it, builders, right? Yeah, exactly. So number 2 would be builders. If you don't have builders, you may have all the material you want, but it's not going to magically shape itself into the house. But do you need anything else? Yes, you do need a plan. I mean, that's actually something which you guys may want to know. If you ever want to build a house, you need to have an approved plan created by an architect. You cannot just start putting bricks together in your backyard. The government will come and give you a fine. And if you build a house like this, they will actually force you to destroy it at your own expense. The only way you can build a house is if you have an approved plan. At one point I was kind of curious about it because I wanted to build a house. So you have 2 options then. You can either hire an architect, which is a lot more expensive, and the architect will create a plan for you according to all the regulations. or you can use one of the pre-approved plans. They have like this already kind of a menu of, but then you have less flexibility, right? You can't have the rooms exactly how you want them. You have to choose from whatever they already decided. Nonetheless, you do need to have a plan. But what else do you need to have? Anything else?
Money.
Well, money, I guess you need to just purchase this stuff, right? It is, in this case, not exactly what I mean. But there is one more thing. Well, land, you can use it as a material. Typically in economics, land and material is kind of connected. No, you need some sort of a purpose for it. Why are you doing it? Do you want to live in it? Do you want it as an investment? What are you doing it for? Because you may have material, you may have builders, you may have a plan, but if you don't have the final goal, why are you doing it, you will never build it. So that's the 4 causes according to Aristotle. He determined that everything has 4 causes. Some sort of substratum, matter of whatever it is you're doing. Material, so that would be what he called material cause. Then you need some sort of something which is going to be doing the change. And he called it efficient cause. Then you need some sort of a plan according to which you're doing it. That would be what he called formal cause. And finally, you need the final goal, and that would be final cause. So 4 causes according to Aristotle. Today when we talk about cause, we mean efficient cause. That's the typical use in language, in science, and so on. We're not really thinking about material as the cause. Although if you think about it, if you don't have material, indeed, you're not going to have any result. But according to Aristotle, the most important actually are the last 2, formal and final cause. Formal and final cause. Why are they the most important? Well, starting from formal cause, of course, that's the essence. That's the what will tell you exactly the function of your house or whatever it is you are doing. And final cause is essential for everything. And this is where we reach the word teleology. Teleology is just this purposeful, goal-oriented structure, which, according to Aristotle, the entire world has. He uses another Greek word, entelechi, which is kind of beautiful way to put it. So everything has its purpose within. This is the literal translation from Greek. Entelechia, echo means having, telos, purpose, entos, within. Having the purpose within. Like an acorn. Acorn already has kind of a little blueprint for a future oak tree. But why everything changes? Well, he actually introduced this concept of what you may say God. But his God is very different from the Christian God. So what was Aristotle's God? It's unmoved mover. He thought that everything, the entire world, is kind of changing towards that final goal, which is this God. God is not, unlike the Christian God, did not create the world. Not transcendent. Not anthropomorphic. In other words, it's not a grandpa with a beard. It's more of an abstract principle. And he's not touching the world in any way, but he causes the world to change because he himself is the final goal. How can that be? Well, imagine if you are in love with somebody. Right? I'm sure you are in love with somebody. Suppose they don't even know you exist. But would that change you? Oh yeah. You would want to dress better, right? You change your hair, you put more makeup. That's the idea. God himself doesn't really care about the world. It's not good as Christian God or anything, but the entire world changes towards God, and that is its final goal or final purpose. All God does himself is thinking. And what is he thinking about? Not human beings. He's thinking about thinking. Because thinking is the highest purpose of everything, highest occupation, you may say. Okay, so that's all we have for today. Hopefully it'll help us to understand Aquinas, who we'll talk about on Wednesday. And then we will come back to Aristotle and talk about his ethics, which is built on all this theory, ethics and politics. And then we'll come back to Hegel, because after all that, it will be easier to understand Hegel. That's all we have for today. I'll see you guys on Wednesday.